Welcome, welcome, welcome to Idiot Seeking Village. We live in the dumbest of all timelines, don't we?
Yes, we do. No doubt about that.
So it's fun to watch this current administration. Fun, I mean fun in like the darkest, most sarcastic way of
Yeah.
watching the current administration flail around desperately in Iran saying, we've won, we've accomplished all our goals. It's like, but have you actually won? Have you actually accomplished anything you set out to do? And oh no, look at that, the goalpost just moved. That's delightful.
I don't know if any point in time have we had like a war that we've decided to start where, yes, people have been anti this war or anti this before, but where we're like, you're just so stupid to even come close to being involved in this war. Like, what are you thinking you're doing? Like, your goals are never going to happen. Like, are you that stupid? I don't think everybody's been a collective, you're a moron.
I think as Sun Tzu wrote in The Art of War, fuck it, bro, let's wing it. So, as I said, we are in the dumbest of all possible timelines, apparently, at the moment. So we're going to take a wild shot in the dark, Adam, and I'm going to get ahead of our next topic before the U.S. does something fucking stupid. Again, pour yourself a Cuba Libre, because we're going to go to the land of classic American cars, Fidel Castro's rockin' beard, and Che Guevara t-shirts. We're going to Cuba.
Oh, we're gonna double fist it, is what you're trying to say.
Yeah, I mean,
Two at a time. Oh my goodness! No wonder that's what his dance move is. You know, He's always double fisting that, jerking off. So might as well.
Let's do it. Yeah, and I love the Che Guevara t-shirt because it is living proof that truly that capitalists will literally sell you the rope you used to hang them with. All right. So before we really dive in here, right, Adam, like if you like, I just named off a couple of things, but if I had to ask you, like, hey, summarize like what you know about Cuba in just a couple of words or just one sentence, what would you cover?
Definitely Castro, because he's the one who I remember the most. He was the boogeyman for most of my childhood.
Mm-hmm.
So definitely Castro. His brother, not so much. So definitely Castro and the Bay of Pigs.
Yep.
And I mean, you go on, but I don't think I could ever be able to put this in one sentence.
No, yeah. What you named, right? What I said before, plus communism, obviously, right? Mm-hmm. It's the only nearby country that is communist. The Bay of Pigs you mentioned. We've got a 60+ year embargo going at this point. The CIA, of course, and their exploding cigars and their attempts to kill Castro in the most comedic fashion possible. The Cuban Missile Crisis. And, we talked about the Mariel boat lift, which is kind of a bit of a deep cut, but we talked about that in our episode on immigration and concentration camps. You might also remember from when we were younger, Elian Gonzalez being abducted from his family, or his extended family, at gunpoint by feds and returned to Cuba because of a custody battle. Star baseball players like former New York Yankees pitcher El Duque, guys who got on boats and risked their lives for wealth and fame in the Americas.
The thing that always made my mind like swirl and under trying to grasp is Guantanamo Bay.
Yes, that one too. Yeah, I didn't
know
how
that even works or functions as like, how is it there and how has that been allowed to exist like that?
We are going to cover that. So I'll tell you exactly when that happens, right? And I think the one last thing, right, when you think of like Cuba and just where it comes up, kind of in contemporary events and whatnot, is you get a lot of shade thrown at Cuba by U.S. politicians, namely those whose family fled Cuba, guys like Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Texas Senator Ted Cruz, former senator from New Jersey, Bob Menendez. These were all guys they or their families had fled from Cuba at some point. And I bring them up because they always shit on the Cuban regime and the Castros and whatnot. And the thing that they do correct this, I don't want to kind of put words in their mouth, but they kind of gloss over. They're always like, yeah, my family fled Cuba. My family fled Cuba. We've got to do something about Castro. It's like, but the thing that they don't make a lot of effort to point out is that their families did not flee the Castro regime. They fled his predecessors who were U.S.-backed strongmen. And so when you kind of dig in, you find a lot of the same. These families and a lot of the Cubans who are in the US, yeah, plenty of them did flee the Castro regime, but many of the most vocal ones and the ones with power, they didn't flee Castro. They fled US backed regimes, particularly Fulgencio Batista, who comes up often. But Castro's government more or less closed the door on any possible return for them to the island, which to me tells you a lot about US foreign policy and maybe everything you need to know. We're happy to have repressive authoritarian dictators oppress local populations as long as they're our repressive authoritarian dictator who gives us what we want and we get a good cut of the profits in
That
return.
checks out.
Yeah. So I think in the same spirit of last week or 2 weeks ago at this point, trying to understand why the hell have Iran and Cuba, Iran and the US been at each other's throats for nearly half a century? Why have Cuba and the US been at each other's throats for almost 70 years at this point?
Yeah, and well, we know that it's because they overthrew the governments we wanted in there.
It's a little bit more complicated than that. So I went into this. I thought this would line up very similarly to our story on Iran. And I thought I learned a lot when kind of going through that one. This one's a lot more complicated. And the reason you and I kept pushing back this recording date was every single time I thought I had a grasp on it, I was realized, oh my God, crap, there's some subtlety and nuance. I've really got to include the details. Because when we talked about Iran, a lot of it was like, I cut out a lot of the local politics and some of the power brokering and things that went back and forth because they didn't materially matter to the big picture. Here, there's a lot more going on the ground. And so we're going to go into a little bit more detail here as a result of trying to understand how the hell we got to where we got to. All right.
Fair enough.
So first off, big picture, Cuba was a backwater of the Spanish Empire for ages, for like hundreds of years. If you've ever read a book, watched a movie, pirate or adventure genre, you'll hear them talk about like the Spanish Main. That's the term for the continental New World holdings of the Spanish Empire. And at the exact same time that 12 of the US states were convening in Philadelphia to sign the US Constitution, the countries and regions that now make up Chile, Argentina, Ecuador, Bolivia, Uruguay, Paraguay, Peru, Colombia, Venezuela, Panama, Guatemala, and all of Central America, Mexico, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Florida, California, Texas, the entirety of the future Louisiana Purchase, Oregon, Idaho, Washington State, parts of Wyoming and Montana, British Columbia, and the entirety of the west coast of North America, clear to the 61st parallel, which is where Anchorage, Alaska is located today, was entirely under the purview of the Spanish crown.
How did the British let that happen?
That is an entirely different conversation. So we're not going to get, because I did have to dig into that to understand what the hell, because I didn't even realize the whole Alaska thing, that they went that far up. But I'm saying at the time of the Constitution, that's what it was. It was all Spanish. But despite the on-paper size of the empire, Spain's wasn't really strong, right? You would think that much land there, and that they were the world's power, they were the reserve currency and all this and that. It's misleading. A lot of that territory was little more than claims to the territory and not direct control on the territory.
Figured,
yeah, they didn't actually have the manpower and resources to directly administer all of it. So in a lot of ways, after what had been at that point an epic 300-year run since Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue, as a run of wealth and dominance, Spain was very much like this paper tiger militarily. And as a society and politically, it was fat and complacent from all of its wealth and inherited success. It was well past its best by date. To hear future Latin American liberators like Simón Bolívar, who visited Madrid and also visited places like Paris in Europe around the same time, they said that Madrid very much like had an air to it of living in the past and being kind of stagnant, and other cities in Europe were starting to look and sound and act like the future, and there was a lot of youthful energy around them. So we could get bogged down in like a massive amount of history of late 18th and early 19th century European history. I'm just going to cut this short and say a short dead dude from Corsica triggered the series of events that would lead to the eventual collapse of the Spanish Empire and the rise of the Latin American liberators, namely guys like Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín. So
crib notes.
Yeah, there you go. And a little Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure throw there. I really hope you appreciated that one. I wrote that one for you.
Thank you. So generous.
So while those guys were establishing New World independence in the early part of the 19th century, Cuba, which was underpopulated, neglected, and economically backward, started to take center stage for Spain. It was one of its few remaining loyal colonies that they knew would hold economic upside if only they would focus on it. And it's pretty much the only place that was not in open rebellion. They advertised themselves as the loyal colony, right? They were kissing Madrid's ass purposefully. So if you were there in like the mid 1700s, Cuba was this settler frontier society. Think farmers, artisans, petty bureaucrats. If you've ever been to like a colonial village and learned about early American life, that's basically what Cuba was at the time, right? It was not overly complex. By the mid 1800s, it became a full-blown plantation society. Small farm plots were consolidated into larger properties because wealth, as it always does, funnels upwards and consolidates towards wealth. In the same spirit, small sugar mills gave way to larger operations because of economies of scale. They were putting money into it. In 1818, Spain opened Cuban ports to trade with the new United States, which created local demands for product and currency and a local trading partner and export market. The U.S. rapidly overtook Spain as Cuba's #1 trading partner as a result of that. So you've got this economic growth, you've got a new trading outpost, you've got a little bit of concerted effort to grow economically because, frankly, Spain has nowhere else to put their resources except for Cuba at this point. Toss in a couple of Spanish immigrants who are looking to make their fortunes and create a life in the New World. You've got this recipe for rapid economic expansion. So Cuba, right around this time, call it 1800 to 1850, was really starting to come into its own and becoming a truly valuable and important resource just on its own. And to whoever can control and influence it has this crown jewel, essentially, within their empire. So control and influence. I want to pause for a second. And I want to talk about the respective attitudes of everyone involved because this really sets the stage for how the next 100 or so years is going to play out. So first, Spain. After said short dead dude invaded and the Peninsular War started in Spain, they lost pretty much all of their American colonies within a 15-year window. So Spain viewed Cuba as this political and economic lifeline that they had to hang on to at any cost. Essentially, we no longer have any legitimacy if we also lose Cuba at this point, and also we're going to be bankrupt if we do. So they had to balance their traditional European rivals' ambitions along with the upstart United States projecting power into the region. The U.S., publicly, they respected Spain's claim and control. Privately, we, the United States, saw Cuba as something that would eventually be ours, one way or another. In 1920, Thomas Jefferson said that the U.S. should buy Cuba, quote, at the first possible opportunity. In 1823, the same year the Monroe Doctrine was issued, John Quincy Adams, who was Secretary of State, argued, quote, it is scarcely possible to resist the conviction that the annexation of Cuba to our federal republic will be indispensable to the continuance and integrity of the Union itself. In 1848, President James Polk actually made a formal offer to the Spanish of $100 million to just straight up buy Cuba from them, which sounds a little bit like Greenland, right? Spoiler alert.
$100 million.
Very, very Dr. Evil, yes. So spoiler alert, they rejected it. And then in 1849, future President James Buchanan wrote to Secretary of State John Clayton, quote, we must have Cuba. We can't do without Cuba. Yeah, does this all sound
torn, like lovelorn, like can't live without my Spanish lovers?
Pretty much, we wanted our hot Latin our hot Cuban lover to join us.
I get it, but you got to once again. There's consent.
So the last major attempt by the U.S. to buy Cuba or acquire it came in 1854 under President Franklin Pierce. Several of his ambassadors in Europe all kind of got together and drew up something called the Ostend Manifesto, which boiled down to, I don't want to get into the details again, it's not that important, but it boils down to, if they won't sell it to us, it's time we take it by force. The problem with that was these guys kind of met in secret, and the House of Representatives, Congress, right, wasn't involved. Not a lot of people were involved. So the document came back to the U.S., and the House of Representatives voted to publish it. And they blew up the whole plan because Pierce was a Southern Democrat at a time when the whole slave state, free state issue was coming to a head domestically. Cuba had a massive slave population because working on sugar plantations sucks, so you import your labor. And it had been eyed by Polk and some of these others that I talked about before as a future slave state. It was very much the future Confederacy viewed Cuba as, when this comes in, it's going to be a slave state and it's going to give us more representation and power within the government. So once the House published it, the northern states, the abolitionist states, as well as Europe and their imperial allies, all denounced the document. And Pierce's administration essentially lost face and they lost any momentum towards Cuba as a result. And it was dead and done as an issue for there. So the underlying motivation there shifts over the years, but the sentiment's the same. Cuba can, should, and will be under U.S. control and influence. Inside of Cuba, there was a mix of perspectives. There were reformists who are looking to make political gains under the Spanish control. Think of these guys as like your typical liberals looking to work within the system. And the reason was simple. Some 80% of Cubans were either Spaniards, like they came from Spain, or they were second, third, fourth generation. So they had ties back to the home country. They weren't looking at this from the perspective of a colonized people. They saw themselves as Spanish in a lot of ways. They were Cuban, but they were Spanish. Then there were the annexationists. They just really wanted to swap out a Spanish daddy for a U.S. daddy on the imperial stage. They saw it as politically economic beneficial, as well as an opportunity, the best opportunity for them to preserve slavery and preserve their economic way of life. And these were, of course, the rich guys, the plantation owners, for the most part. And then you had a third group, fun group, the radical pro-independence guys. And for obvious reasons, as most governments do, especially in this time, you have some radical advocating for the overthrow of the government, you exile them, you banish them to somewhere, you get rid of them. So a lot of those guys came to the U.S. and they either started or really helped contribute and grow to the Cuban communities here in the U.S. Places like Key West, Ybor City in Tampa, New York, and New Orleans, major locations for them. But aside from those wealthy plantation owners who were like, give it to me, Daddy USA, I'm down, there was a lot of hesitation among the Cubans. And I think a good quote here comes from Jose Marti, who's a future independence leader, who wrote, quote, "Once the United States is in Cuba, who will get her out?" And then in another letter that he started actually the day before he was killed in battle by the Spanish, he wrote, quote, "It is my duty to prevent, by the independence of Cuba, the United States from spreading over the West Indies and falling with that added weight upon other lands of our America." So those are kind of like the big, broad geopolitical and like local undercurrents that are kind of be present for the next century or so, and really is important and kind of pretty consistent across the board. So right now we're around like 1850. Right? That's where I've cut it off for the moment. I'm going to jump ahead the next 50 years, not because it's not important, but because we're going to get dragged down here in a lot of details. Essentially, what you need to know is between 1850 and 1898, there was 3 separate wars of independence by the Cubans against the Spanish. The last one, you will have heard of this. It involves friend of the pod, Valeriano Weyler, who was a Spanish general we learned about in our episode on concentration camps, who first exposed the U.S. to mass civilian incarceration tactics, which we first responded to with horror and shock, and then immediately implemented in the Philippines once we got the first chance to do so. So this is the point, 1898, when you learn in school about the explosion on the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, which triggers the Spanish-American War, which ends with the U.S. administering Cuba directly until a provisional government and constitution can be established. The result is the Republic of Cuba is born in 1902. So the long-running Spanish-American-Cuban menage a trois that ran for basically the entirety of the 19th century, it's done, and now it's just Cuba and the U.S. hooking up together. The key thing, yeah, it's nice and sexy. Like I said, a little Latin lover.
Don't like to share. We are very, very bad at that.
The key thing here that's going to have a major impact on the next 30 years or so is something called the Platt Amendment, which the U.S. basically forced on the Cubans to include in their constitution in exchange for military withdrawal. Political cover here for the Americans is that We want to make sure that an independent Cuban government gets on its feet and is up and running on its own, right? Then there aren't going to be problems. But we've been wanting the island for a century at this point. So the Platt Amendment was really a bunch of fail-safes to keep the U.S. projecting power over Cuba and to preserve its financial and economic interests. It included a guarantee that Cuba would not cede land to any foreign power except the U.S. It limited Cuba's ability to negotiate with other countries. It established the U.S. naval base in Guantanamo Bay, as you were asking. And lastly, it gave the U.S. the right to intervene in Cuba to preserve Cuban independence. So, waterboarding, a direct result of the Platt Amendment. You're welcome, America.
It's just like, it's funny. The more we do this, it's just the more we hear like the same thing. It's like you try so hard to stop people from having freedom that eventually they revolt and they fight back, and then eventually they have their independence, and then somebody else comes around and fucks it up. It's the same thing over and over again. All because people cannot share some of their wealth. It's so stupid and silly.
A lot of stupid shit just so a couple of people can make a couple extra bucks.
Yeah.
And
I'm pretty sure they're not going to be able to take with them.
And we're happy to contradict ourselves on our ideals and our goals and whatnot to get that. And it's pretty consistent, kind of crazy. And so that last one, right? The right to intervene in Cuba to preserve Cuban independence. Come on, man. You and I both know that shit is going to be abused and justified on the flimsiest of reasons. If I've ever seen anything written politically, that's just going to be manipulated by someone with an agenda. That is it.
Yeah. Oh, you voted for that guy. We don't like him. Nah, no good.
Exactly. So, didn't take long. The U.S. first intervened under the Platt Amendment in 1906. It has been 4 years. And we stayed until 1909. We then again intervened during a rebellion in 1912. So we were there for 3 years, left for 3 years, came back 3 years later. But that one we didn't stay for very long. And then again, 1917, 1922, we were back. Yet again, more rebellions, more domestic unrest, and the U.S. keeps throwing in the Marines to protect its own assets and its economic interests. So in case you can't tell, Republican Cuban politics, not super stable.
No.
So, as I said, the Marines were getting sent in to protect U.S. assets. Economically, Cuba's growth was being driven by U.S. financiers and U.S. ownership of its productive assets, primarily sugar plantations and mills, railroads and utilities, and banking and infrastructure. Those were overwhelmingly owned by the U.S. In 1910, U.S. investments in Cuba numbered around $200 million. By 1924, that number was about $1.25 billion. We're sending in the Marines because we got a fuck ton of cash on the line, and we are not going to lose it. So in that same time frame, that first kind of quarter of a century, Cuba modernized a lot. They expanded the rail system. They eventually started to build a highway system, all on the back of the sugar economy booming. And on a per capita basis, actually in that time, the rail system was more extensive than many European ones. And all because the sugar industry demanded it. They had an absolute need for it from an agricultural perspective. In 1920, they got a whole bunch of loans to further take advantage of the sugar boom. And in 1923, get this, I'd never heard of this before. The Federal Reserve Banks of Boston and Atlanta both opened branches on the island to help control cash flows.
When have you a lot of cash coming in?
When have you ever heard of the Fed opening branches in a foreign country to help control cash flow? That was the first time I'd ever heard of that. I was blown away by that.
Explains America's addiction to sugar.
Sugar and sending in the Marines. Yeah, for both of those. Well, I like the fact that our addiction to diabetes requires the armed forces.
Yes.
Yeah. So what happens with boom times? They eventually collapse, right? So 1925, the sugar boom collapsed, and it took Cuba's economy with it. Basically, anyone who was still a small producer who was getting by, they had to sell their assets. They got swallowed up by larger plantation owners and largely to U.S. interests who owned them. To give you a sense of scale, by 1926, U.S. companies owned 60% of Cuba's sugar outright in the industry, milling and production and farming and whatnot, and they imported 95% of its production. Like, they were deeply, deeply dependent on the U.S. So the Cubans, they've got their own country now, right? But they are losing their economic freedom. They were also chafing under the Platt Amendment because they were losing their sovereignty. So, like, they've got their own country, but they're a vassal state to the U.S. In basically all but name. In 1923, a gentleman, historian Ramiro Guerra y Sanchez, said, quote, "The Cuban who comes to know the history of our past will feel heir to a rich patrimony and will discover in that very legacy the means to make it greater. Our history is the only thing that we possess that is genuinely ours." He's really speaking to disenfranchisement there. In 1933, literary critic George Menache wrote that, quote, "The Cubans have not been able to shape their destiny according to their own will because that will has been laid in semi-subjugation." So these guys know. Specifically, George writes about the Platt Amendment, quote, "It resulted in crushing the Cuban sentiment of self-determination when it imposed express limits on the exercise of the collective will." So these guys know. They know they've got their country, but they don't have their freedom in any way, shape, or form, and not in a meaningful manner. So this is where we start to take the big turn towards how we get to the modern day. So in 1924, Cuba elected a new president, Gerardo Machado. So Machado was a former Independence War hero. I believe he was a general. He was a cattle rancher, and he was kind of this archetypical strongman nationalist type. He had a big, broad swath of support from the political classes as well as the business people. And what he saw was a mandate to modernize Cuba even further. His slogan, when you kind of boil it down, was Cuba for Cubans, which I think if we borrowed from today would probably sound a lot like Cuba first.
Probably.
Yeah. So for his first 2 years, Machado was super popular, actually, because he came in with good support. To the Americans, he was stable, protected property rights, and he paid his debts. For the Cubans, he expanded the highway system, he expanded the University of Havana, he implemented protective tariffs, and things were turning around and starting to look good, and the economy was diversifying and expanding. He also took advantage of prohibition, which had launched in the U.S., to expand the existing vice tourism sector. And so now suddenly Havana becomes a booming tourist destination for drinking, gambling, and prostitution. So it is a really good nightlife if you're loaded.
Which was it casino? Not casino. Was it like good? No, was it Goodfellas Godfather where they like fled during the revolution and they left the casinos and they were in the casinos and they had to like escape by boat?
Yeah, you're saying all of them. I want to say it's The Godfather, but I feel like, yeah, it's been so long since I've watched it. I think it is. Yeah,
because I think that's where he was like learning that somebody had betrayed him.
Yeah, it's one. There's a whole scene where they're in Havana during the I believe during the revolution. They do that. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, this is where it was actually, and it wasn't just, this was like a mob thing, but it was also a local thing. So this actually expands a big kind of mafia connection to Cuba at the same time. So he also implemented something called the cooperative system, where the liberals, conservatives, and the populist parties all shared power in his government. So the idea was they would all get a say and they didn't have to fight each other to get legislation done that they wanted because the country had upside, right? It needed to grow. And so people are more on the same page than not on the same page. So, but what that does, though, is it consolidated power under him and to him, right? If you wanted to get anything done, you no longer played parliamentary politics. You pledged fealty to Machado, right? To the strongman here. And so it effectively eliminated political opposition. Sounds good on the surface. It collapses once you think about it for more than 2 seconds. So, Adam, remember we talked about Iran the other day. What does any aspiring authoritarian dictator need?
A special police force.
Damn right. Damn right. So we've created our token political groups. Now we're creating the secret police. And in Cuba, that took the form of a group that would eventually come to known as La Porra. So these men initially operated outside of the legal framework, and they were loyal only to Machado himself, and they engaged in the usual secret police shenanigans of intimidation, beatings, and assassinations. Those scamps. And so in 1925, at the same time, 2 major labor institutions were founded in Cuba, one communist, the other anarchist. Machado's approach to them was the same as the political parties. He wants to co-opt them and bring them into the fold inside the government. so that he could control them and he could placate them. The labor groups said no, and they found themselves subject to repression and assassinations by the secret police, by La Porra. This has the effect of radicalizing the labor groups. It pushes them underground, and it grows the ranks of the communists in particular, who were kind of on the receiving end of this the worst. And it strengthened their resolve to work against the government. So now he's creating the conditions for future problems through the violence. So now, though, you've got economic growth at the cost of political repression. Not a problem for the US. We freaking love that. We do it everywhere. But Machado, after a couple of years, he was constitutionally barred. He couldn't run for re-election. But Adam, does that stop him?
No.
No, certainly does not. So he ordered up a constitutional convention, and between 1927 and 1928, they issued a new constitution, and he ran for election for a new 6-year term that he previously was not eligible for, and his three-headed cooperative rubber stamped this, and he continued to keep power. This, because he knew he got away with something, this is when he took an even more authoritarian turn. La Porra became formalized and much more active. He bypassed the civilian institutions and started building relationships directly with the officer corps of the Cuban army. So he was building loyalty to him and bypassing the institutions he should have gone through as an intermediary. This starts to really set the stage between political violence and police repression and the military relationships for what the next phase of Cuban history is going to kind of hinge on. So now we're talking around 1929, 1930, and he gets hit with a double whammy. 1, the Great Depression, and 2, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which you also learned about in school. These crushed the Cuban economy. Machado couldn't pay anyone. He couldn't invest in his public works projects. And now he wasn't just dealing with this kind of underground leftist labor communist resistance. Student groups and middle-class professionals were all also starting to push back. They're like, you can beat and kill us as long as we're making money. But when there's no jobs and no bread on the table, then we fight back.
Once again, it's the same thing. Like with when we spoke to your aunt, the young and the unions.
Mm-hmm.
That's the same thing all the time. Those are the ones who fight back because the college kids and the young people, they want a future and they don't see one.
Yep.
And then you have the unions are like, I got to put food on the table. I have no way of putting food on the table anymore. Fuck you.
It's the people who don't have a lot and who are now losing that and they don't want to lose it. And the people who are looking at their futures and going, what is my future? And where is it? Why do I not have it? Exactly. That's what it always is. So yeah, so but now you've got the working class, you've got the middle class professionals, and you've got the students all up in arms. Machado, he doesn't come to the table. He gets violent and he sicks both La Porra and the army on them. And in response, and we're talking like doctors, lawyers, middle-class professionals, all these groups, they take guerrilla actions, they do strikes, and they engage in bombings. I'm going to quote from the New York Times in 1933. Quote, he instituted martial law, suspended constitutional guarantees, put the newspapers under strict censorship, forbade opposition political parties to organize or hold meetings, threw hundreds of his political enemies into prison or exile, and upheld the secret police in widespread official assassinations of opposition under the law of flight. The student movement grew into the ABC, a powerful secret society, which throughout 1932 engaged in a deadly underground war of terror with the Machado secret police. Assassinations and bombings marked the terror on both sides, and many were killed, including students from some of the best families in Cuba, and high government and army officials, including the president of the Cuban Senate and the head of the secret police. End quote. So yeah, it's like, it got real really fast. And I remember when I read that, I didn't realize a lot of sources are like, yeah, it got violent. I'm like, I didn't realize that the head of the secret police and the president of the Senate and all these like really high-ranking officials all got killed as a result. So 3 years of this goes on. The business community and Washington, now under President Roosevelt, they lost their patience with Machado. Business interests want one thing above all, and that is stability. And they were happy to let Machado crack skulls when he delivered stability, and that stability delivered profits. That stopped being the case, and they withdrew their support. And once Roosevelt implemented the good neighbor policy, Machado lost his default U.S. backing, and he was done. In August of 1933, he fled to the Bahamas. See, yeah.
Of one island for the other. I love that. Great.
Basically. So, in summary, Machado came in as, again, this nationalist reformer. He built real things while dismantling every check on his power. Does that somewhat sound familiar, Adam?
No, not at all.
Not only fan. No, definitely not. No bells are ringing around. He used terror to try and crush the labor movement, but all he did was turn it to radicalism. He got wiped out by the Depression economically and the general strike. He left behind a legacy of destroyed and corrupted public institutions. The liberal and conservative parties never recovered from their complicity under Machado. The legislature, the judiciary, the press, there was basically no effective civilian infrastructure left. Everything rolled up to the man. And he did that very, very quickly in only a couple of years. And now you also had a generation of student activists who had been baptized in radical politics and violence, and they were now entering broader society. The only institution with island-wide reach that was still functional was the military. Now, the officers themselves, because Machado had built personal relationships and cultivated their loyalty, they were completely discredited, right? They were Machado's men. But the enlisted men and the NCOs, the non-commissioned officers, weren't. Enter Fulgencio Batista. Adam, before we keep going, let's call it a day, and let's record in part 2, and we'll continue the story from there.
Okay.
Thoughts on what we got so far?
Good. Just more fucking same depressing shit as always. It's incredible how like it's so repetitive, and I still can't fathom why we continue on this drive of like superiority and control over shit and waste all this time on this instead of just being like, let fuckers live. Let's try to get some kind of like normalcy. Let people do stuff. It's crazy. It's like you got to work so hard to try to overthrow a fucking government that shouldn't be doing what it's doing, and then you overthrow it, and then you're gonna do stupid shit anyway. Because it's gonna come. You're gonna have Castro come in, and not gonna make things better eventually.
Well, we'll see why Castro comes in, because at this point, it's not a given that he is. And so that's why, as I said, I thought this story was going to align much more with the Iranian story that we covered. And I realized there's so much more going on the ground and so much shifting here that really Iran, the story there is it's outside influence and internal resentment to that outside influence. And then because the power within is aligned with those outside interests, the resentment turns against the leadership. And this is so much more complex than that, and it gets even more complex. So let's pause for now. We'll pick this up in part 2. We'll catch you all later. Bye.
Idiots Seeking Village is a production of Village Idiots Media. For more, find us online at villageidiotsmedia.com or find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon, and wherever you get podcasts.